Welcome to all the viewers and listeners of the Debate Club. Ilan Pappe is a professor of history and political science teaching at the University of Exeter in Great Britain and a director of European Center for the Palestinian Studies. Professor Pappe will debate Mojmír Kallus, who is the president of the International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem in Prague, known as ICEJ. Christian Zionist Kallus and Jewish anti-Zionist Pappe will discuss moral and historical issues connected to the creation and existence of the Israeli state. This will also include a question of democracy in the Jewish state, which Ilan Pappe sees as an oxymoron. You cannot have an apartheid, decades of military occupation, discriminatory laws, policy of ongoing ethnic cleansing and cold years of democracy, says the Israeli historian. Our quest will examine the past and possible future.
Professor, welcome to Prague.
Thank you.
I have welcomed the opportunity to sit with you and meet in person and hear your views.
Thank you.
Let me say at the outset that my weakness is that I am not a historian, so I have no match to your detailed knowledge of history. I will listen to what you have to say, and I have some more general questions which come from the understanding of how I perceive your position. My major concern is that while I am ready to admit many of the facts that you and other new historians have been uncovering recently, and I'm not at all in the business of whitewashing everything Israel does, so I'm fully prepared to admit that. What I'm concerned about is that your interpretation of the history seems to be quite one-sided, and it seems to be leading to the dismantling of the Jewish state in effect. So my concern is, or my question, whether you see any legitimacy of the Jewish state at all, and another concern is that this kind of theory leads to the legitimization of an entity, and that is a welcome food for the enemies, not only of the State of Israel, but also of Jews worldwide, who then take it on a further step to demonization and to hatred and prejudice. And that seems to be dangerous. So these are my concerns, and I'm sure you're going to address them as we go on.
Yes. So maybe we should start with the idea of delegitimization. It's a good departure point, and then we can move on back in time, maybe. I think that when you talk about delegitimizing an entity, you have to think, what is an entity? An entity is the political system, and it is also an organic society. So when people talk about delegitimizing a state or an organic society, this is a bit ridiculous, because this is something that is there. I'll give you an example. If some people would say that the Jews who came from Germany or Czechoslovakia or Iraq should go back to these countries to dismantle the State of Israel and to return the clock backwards to pre-1882, this is ahistorical and ridiculous in my eyes. So this is not the business I'm involved in. However, when you say that the Czechoslovakia under communist regime, South Africa under apartheid regime, Chile under Pinochet, are countries which have a regime that you want to change, that indeed you want to delegitimize, because you think the regime represents an ideological position or pursues policies that you find morally unacceptable. It doesn't mean you delegitimize Chile. It means that you want to see a more democratic Chile. And this is my main concern. My main concern is about the regime in Israel. And the regime in Israel is based on an idea which I think is non-existence, is impossible. That you can have a Jewish state and a democratic state. You cannot have a Christian state and a democratic state. You cannot have a Muslim state and a democratic state. But you also cannot have a Jewish state and a democratic state. So we have to decide. Would you like to have a Jewish state, but not democratic? Or democratic state would be not the Jewish state? And I opt for the second option. Because I think I would like to live not only with my own people, but I would like to live with others as equals. So that's my point. I delegitimize the idea of exclusivity, of ethnic purity. I think particular Jews should be worried about such ideas, because they were victims of such ideas in the past.
Well, thank you. That's heartwarming in a way. It seems to me a bit idealistic because on the one hand you have the society in Israel, which I would probably differ in the description of the regime, because I perceive it, and I'm coming there many times a year, as a very free society where I certainly can see no apartheid when Arabs are involved in the parliament and in the IDF and so forth. I don't say that they are not discriminated against in many areas, but I would venture to say that this is the fate of minority in every country. But so far I would have a different opinion on the state of Israel. My main concern is I'm fully understand that the one-state democratic solution looks very nice on paper. And by the way, I'm no proponent of the two-state solution at all, because after all, we have seen 60 years without wars in Europe, but we haven't arrived at this peace by putting borders and fences and dividing peoples. We have arrived at the solution by the very opposite, by dismantling borders, by making contacts between people, by letting them know each other. And this is what I believe is the only solution for a lasting peace anywhere. My concern is with the other side. If they are the Arab regimes, which we can see in Gaza, in the West Bank, or in other Arab nations, if they are ready to engage in such kind of peaceful dialogue with the Jews. So this is the weak point I see on that.
Right. Let me first say that I think that the difference between Israel and, let's say, apartheid South Africa is that the apartheid in Israel towards the Palestinians is not a petty apartheid. I'll explain what I mean by that. Petty apartheid is when you force people of different races to use different services, like buses, toilets, and so on. The discrimination of a Jewish state that defines the state according to religion and ethnicity, not according to citizenship, which is what Israel is doing, is that it's far more hidden. And then maybe 1 or 2, even 3 visits are not enough to see that. You have a segregated educational system up to the university. You have a discriminatory laws when it comes to land ownership, because the land belongs to the Jewish agency. And if you are a non-Jew, you don't have the same right to the land. It's not surprising that although the number of Palestinians inside the state of Israel have tripled, there is not one new Palestinian settlement or village or neighborhood built, whereas there are 1,000 new Jewish settlements built. There's also discrimination on the level of budgets, services, and what in Republican terms we call the common good. If the common good belongs to the Jewish people, when you're not a Jew, you're outside of it. So I think Israel, in this respect, cannot be defined as a democracy. But far more important, of course, democracies don't occupy another people for 45 years. And you cannot separate the occupation from your own life, which Israelis think that they can do. The Green Line doesn't create a democratic Israel, in an occupied West Bank. It's all over the place. So that's one point you've mentioned that I would like to respond to. The second point you mentioned, and that's an important point, how can one trust a democratic future given, if I may phrase what you said, and you'll tell me if I'm putting it rightly, given the political culture of the Arab world.
Yes.
Is that a fair, that's a fair point? And indeed, that's a worrying. I don't ignore it. I think it's an important point. But I think because I live there, and I would like to live there even more than I do now under the circumstances, I do not base my analysis on the political future of the state only on an abstract notions of what is Arab culture, Islam, and all these issues that can seem to be disincentive for a democratic future. I base my vision on my own political activism and my own intimate relationship. And when I look at my own personal life, I realize how different I am from many of my Israeli Jews. I speak Arabic, they don't. Most of my friends are Palestinians. Most of my Israeli Jewish friends have not met Palestinians beyond someone who provides them services like a dishwasher or road sweepers and so on. And I was involved in units in the academia and in politics where I was a minority because the majority were Arabs, whether it was a political party or an academic department. And that experience convinced me that the issue of a person's ability to be a democrat, if you want, as a citizen, have very little to do with your religious or ethnic origin. I find it a very racist notion, actually, to assume that if you're an Arab, you're not Democrat, and if you're a Jew, you're a Democrat. The non-democratic Jews are quite frightening, as are the non-democratic Arabs. And my life around the left groups in Israel, my connections with people in the Arab world, convinced me, also my reading of history, that there is a very important section of the Arab society in general, and the Palestinian society in particular, that really worship and admire the idea of democracy. They really like the idea. It's part of their vision of good life. And there are others there who are against it. That is absolutely true. But I found very few societies in the world which don't have these two elements in them. Europeans seem to feel that they are now democratic, and therefore all the rest of the world is disadvantaged or less progressive than they are. But this is because people are not historians, and they forget what happened here 40 years ago, or even 30 years ago. I don't think that this is an indication that there is a connection between your religion or history or ethnic identity and your ability to live in a democratic life. In fact, I would claim, although and I will finish because I think I took too much time on this one, I would claim that although I fully understand the Israeli fear of losing the Jewish majority, I'm an Israeli, so I understand this fear very well, I don't think it's a warranted fear. And secondly, I think it's a risk worth taking, because if you will continue to demand a Jewish majority, you will have to, in the end of the day, to resort to very uncivilized methods to keep that majority. And you will become like your worst enemies. And that's much more worrying than having an Arab majority in my eyes.
Yes. Well, I understand and I acknowledge that this is a major concern for any Israeli politician. And I would also agree fully that the ability to be a Democrat is not contingent on your ethnicity or religion or at all. And I would also add that I have many friends among the Arabs, and in particular among Arab Christians. So I'm at least to a degree familiar with the situation. I would even agree that the State of Israel could do much more to care for the Arab population. This is, in my opinion, one of the mistakes that has been consistently perpetrated or made of the neglect of the Arab population. But again, my problem is not with the people, not with the Palestinians, with the Arab people. The Palestinians are, I'm sure, one of the most democratic parts of the Arab nation, and they are also very educated and everything. So they are in a very good position, actually, to be in a democratic state. But unfortunately, they seem to be ruled by a regime which brings back some memories of our own past. I don't want to make any comparisons, but it reminds me of an old joke that was here under the communist time. What's the difference between freedom of speech in the US and in the USSR? Well, in the US, you can freely criticize the American president. And in the Soviet Union, you can also freely criticize the American president. You know, yes. So I will be much more comforted by the theories like yours when there will be an Ilan Pappe on the Palestinian side who would be as radical in debunking the Palestinian narrative and as you are in doing so on the Jewish side. You know what I mean?
Yes, I know what you mean. In fact, I think there are quite a few. There are even more, to my mind, on the Palestinian side now than there are on the Israeli side. It used to be the other way around, and that's not surprising historically. If you think about situation of colonization and occupation, the occupier and the colonizer is this, on the side of the occupier and the colonizer, this is where the process of change begins, because of the balance of power. The balance of power determines where would be the location that the first new ideas would emerge. They don't emerge amongst the occupied people. They don't emerge among the people who became refugees. It emerges among the people who have a solid state, who have a powerful position. So it's not surprising that historically speaking, the new thinking, we mentioned the new historians, but that's just one indication that there is an attempt in Israel to rethink the reality, began on Israel, on the Israeli side. But I think it was reciprocated. If you read the books of Palestinian historians, such as Rashid Khalidi, Bishara Dumani, prominent Palestinian historians, some of them work in the West Bank, some of them work as historians in American universities and Western universities, you will see that there's something common to the way I and my colleagues work on Israel and they work on the Palestinian side. We are trying to liberate ourselves from national mythologies and provide a history that shows that, in fact, when political interests do not interfere and ideas such as nationalism do not take over, people can live together on the basis of the social interest, economic interests, and civic interests. Now, it's true that to begin with, this was more popular with Jews, but now it's more popular with the Palestinians. So I think this is something important to mention. In 1998, I organized with a Palestinian friend of mine a group that was called the Bridging Narrative. This was 10 Israeli historians and 10 Palestinian historians. And we wrote together a common narrative for the land because we believe that if you agree about the history, you can agree about the future. And it was published in a book called Across the Wall, came out in English, in German, in Spanish, in French, not in Czech. It shows how 20 people, quite non-historians on both sides, were able to agree on the basic chapters on the history of that land. And I think that's a very important process, and one should acknowledge that there are people on both sides who are willing to do this. Both sides would have to give up two dreams. The Jewish side will have to give up the dream of a Jewish exclusivity. It's going to be disastrous if they will continue to do this. They will not alienate only the Arab world and the Muslim world, which they do now. and they can still feel secure because the West is alienated by the Islamic world. So Israel feels it's a spearhead in the war against Islam. But it begins to alienate also people in the West. And it will have to give up the idea, with all the fears that go with it. And the Palestinians will have to give up the idea of a Palestinian nation state. As my dear friend and late friend Edward Said said, Jews and Palestinians were brought together to one place. They both don't like the idea, but they will have to live together. And the question is, what is the right political outfit that would respect the rights and aspirations of both sides? And I think neither the state of Israel as it exists now and the occupation of the West Bank respects the rights of both sides, and neither the idea of a two-state solution. So I think we have to work very hard to try and find such a political outfit.
Well, again, it sounds very nice on paper. Your children live in Israel, so what is your expectation of how this solution, if found, could work out for your children? What is the kind of land you would like for them to live in?
Yeah. My children are an interesting story because they were brought up in a very non-typical Israeli Jewish house, which was full of Palestinian friends. And when they brought for the first time their schoolmates to the house, the parents were worried because it's a house that is known to have a lot of Arabs in it. I'm very proud that my children have no fear of a person because of who they are, but because of what they do. We taught them to be fearful of what people do, not of their identity. Most of their friends in the classroom are being taught by the educational system that they should fear a person because he's an Arab, not because he's a bad man or a good man. So my children, my big question is, how irresponsible am I to educate my children in a virtual reality that does not fit the outside reality? But my dream is that the reality I created at home, which is a bilingual, binational, if you want, democratic, would be the reality outside. So that's my dream. Will they get there? I don't know. I think that I'll tell you where I feel concerned. My concern is not whether my ideas are right or wrong. My concern is that, as a historian, I know that when situations are corrupt, are not moral, as I read them, the change does not come through nice negotiations. Changes come usually through catastrophe. And sometimes you need a catastrophe to rearrange human life. So I do hope that this will not be necessary in the case of Israel and Palestine. I'm not sure. But I see my children implementing what they believe in because of the education they got at home, not because of the education they got in school. They really are naive. They believe that their Arab friends and their Jewish friends are the same, and they don't care whether they live in a Jewish state. They do care if they live in a democratic state or not. My problem is that the vast majority of people around them don't think that way. But they have a mission for life to change it with others. And I have many Palestinian friends who I know educate their children in a similar way.
Let's try to imagine how it could be if there is indeed one state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean with now approximately 50-50 population, right. Jews, Arabs. Mm-hmm. Then you have elections, then you create a government. What if the Jews are then in the minority in this one state? How can you, judging from similar regimes, similar mm-hmm. situations, how would you guarantee that the new majority would not behave like they behave in other countries? Yeah. And I'm afraid that the Arab Spring is a terrifying picture, which of course bears no comparison, but even if there are no Jews involved, like in Syria, Libya, Egypt, the situation for minorities, and I'm especially concerned with Arab Christians because they are a minority within their societies, I don't see their situation becoming better. I, on the contrary, see very radical elements taking power, gaining prominence, or the general chaos is also quite dangerous, always to the weak, to the weaker, to the minority. So again, I have nothing against this theoretical concept, but I find it very difficult to imagine how, save for a catastrophe, how it could be practically implemented.
Yeah. Well, I remember white people in South Africa explaining to me before apartheid fell that the day Mandela would be a president, all the whites would be slaughtered, which didn't happen. And I think that fear is both authentic, but is also manipulated, and is partly validated and partly unfounded. But fear is something that has to be respected. What I'm aiming at is saying that although I have no fear, I don't think that I would live worse under a place where the Arabs, a majority, as I explained, because of my own personal experience. I respect the fact that a lot of Jews would see that as a very, at best, troubling scenario, if not worse than that. So because I want to respect this fear, I think there are many mechanisms you can put in place to contain the fear. You do not change a reality that you have now in Israel, where there is actually one state. Israel controls most of what used to be Palestine, but does not control it democratically. You do not change it in one day, because then you're right. It's chaotic, it can be revengeful, it can be very dangerous. But you can do it in an evolutionary way. You can do it in a more measured way. I'm not a great believer in it, but if everybody would have agreed on the binational state, for instance, then you have a model by which you do not create a democracy which is based on one person, one vote, but you have an agreement that respects the two national movements or national groups' wish for existence or autonomy, which is much better than the situation now. It's not my optimistic or best scenario, but I would rather have that than what we have now. And I think that with a long durée, kind of a long process of change, confidence is being built. But I think my main problem with what you say, and maybe that's my main problem of explaining this to Israelis, and I still have to find a way, I don't share this absence of confidence in my Palestinian friends. Regardless of the Arab Spring or not the Arab Spring, so many of the people I grew up with, who are my intimate friends, are the people I really want to build a state with. They are both Muslims and they are Christians, and I cannot see them in any possible scenario wishing to live in, let's say, what you describe, which would be, I suppose, an Arab nation state that gets rid of the Jews or discriminates against the Jews or worse. They are not these kind of people. This is an assumption that if you are a Palestinian and not a Christian Palestinian, your aim in life would be to do what? To kill Jews, to get rid of the Jews, not to share the land with them. I think the basic impulse of Palestinians, definitely those who live inside Israel, but also those who live in the occupied territories, and definitely those who live in the exilic communities, the vast majority want normal life. I don't think that the plan for the next 20 years is a plan for revenge. I don't think they dream of the day we'll go to Haifa, we'll get Ilan Pappe and hang him on the tree. I don't think that's what they plan, is to say, wow, can you imagine that I could be an equal citizen, that I can drive from Ramallah to Bethlehem without being stopped 5 times, that all my family members would not be in jail but would be at home. That's their dream. I don't think they are human. It's a normal human impulse. And of course, and I will end with this, when an occupation and oppression continues for long, there are radical elements, I'm not denying this, who are dreaming of revenge, who are using very violent means to change the reality. But these groups lose their support and popularity if there is a sense that the occupation and the oppression is fading away. I mean, the one is connected to the other. Hamas, or whatever Hamas represented, was not very popular when Palestinians thought that there was a chance for a genuine settlement at the beginning of the Oslo process. When did it become strong again? When there was a sense that peace is fading away. And then you go for other options. So for me, it's not theoretical. For me, it's very real. It's maybe something that politicians don't like to do. I deduce from my local life to the general life. I don't expect the general life to tell me how to live my local life. And I think that is something that is being created on the ground in Israel in any case, Israel and Palestine. There are not two states. You've been there. Yeah. There's no two states. There's one state. And when people are allowed, they create friendships. We have warriors on both sides that are talking about the evils of violence on both sides. We have bereaved parents who sit together every week and talk about a different future. And both sides realize that the drive for exclusivity on both sides is what you used to call in the Cold War MAD, a mutual assured destruction. So we have to build something different.
Okay, well, I think it's clear that we agree on some, we disagree on some, especially on the, I would just reiterate that I would distinguish between the people and the regime, because I know from my own experience that the communist regime in Czechoslovakia looked and was terrible, which doesn't say anything about the kind of people who lived here. Most of them did not support the regime, some of them did out of fear, and all they wanted was to lead normal life. So I think this is very common human. We probably differ on the assessment of the realistic way of how to overcome this problem, and maybe there's also a little bit of the perennial question: what is first, if the egg or the hen? You know, yeah. So if you start by, and it reminds me of a rabbinic discourse on how to achieve peace. It is in the Torah where Abraham was digging these wells, and then the Philistines came and destroy them, and then Isaac was digging them again, and there was strife, sitna, and then in a certain moment they came to an agreement. And the big debate is what was the prerequisite, if the peace initiative should be offered first, or if they should keep the ground and then the peace would come. So basically these are two legitimate ways. I think we could move on from this. Please. Maybe, if I may, this is slightly more connected to the boycott, the BDS campaign, which I understand now your point or your motivation for this. But aren't you concerned that supporting these measures can backfire or can have side effects in simply fomenting the old anti-Jewish prejudice, because many people are not like you. They hate the Jews and they take any opportunity to bash them, and so maybe inadvertently these calls can result in supporting this trend, which I find utterly negative.
Okay. It's a good moral question. If Jews do something which they shouldn't do, in the name of a Jewish state or in the name of a Jewish national movement. If they kill, they dispossess, they abuse human rights and civil rights, should I be silent because my criticism on the Jews who do these things would be welcomed by anti-Semites? I think for me the most important value is the value of human rights and civil rights, not the value of the Jewish tribe. I never accepted and that's one of the problems with the Jewish religion as I see it. This idea of the chosen people, the exclusivity. I don't think it's a very healthy way to go around the world by saying we are the chosen people, we have some superior moral issues. I'm much more attached to the later interpretation of Judaism. That's how I see myself as a Jew. I think there's a much better universal legacy of Judaism that developed in the 14th and 15th century, to which I really feel strongly attached, where the idea was the Jews are part of a group that have to improve life through introducing to any society in which they live in ideas of equality, knowledge, freedom, and so on. And on the basis of this, my interpretation of Judaism, I think it's an imperative for me to say that if anyone abuses human rights and civil rights, I will do everything to stop him or her, whether they are Jews, Christians, or Muslims. Now, if someone, let's play it in a different way. Let's say I'm very concerned about Islamophobia, which is also quite an important facet of our reality in this country as well as in other countries. Islamophobia is as bad as anti-Semitism. And let's say I say to myself, I don't like the way Iran treats its citizens, and I don't like the way Iran treats its citizens. And I would say, wait a minute, I will tone down my criticism on Iran because I don't want to foment Islamophobic ideas. I've never ever heard anyone saying to me, tone down your criticism on an Islamic abusive regime because it can foment Islamophobia. So in a similar way, I don't think that I would ignore my imperative to criticize Israel and to stop Israel if it's possible, because it can raise the level of anti-Semitism and so on. Having said that, I must say that I think that the State of Israel is overusing the association between anti-Semitism and criticism on the State of Israel. There is anti-Semitism, undoubtedly. It's an old phenomenon and goes back before the State of Israel was created. Unfortunately, I don't think it would be very easy to get rid of it. I'm not sure that the State of Israel is not contributing to it. And I would, as an Israeli, I am much more bothered, and I would suggest that people who support Israel, we should be bothered much more by the connection there is between anti-Semitism, especially in Europe, wish not to see the Jews in Europe, and the Zionists wish not to see the Jews in Europe. There's a certain connection that troubles me a lot. I thought about it when I visited the very important Jewish museum and quarter in Prague, and it's a very impressive site, a very touching one, very moving one, reading about the 80,000 Jews who were killed. And there was, at the end of the museum, there was this assumption that the best solution to what happened to the Jews of Prague was the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And I thought that's a very bizarre logic. The logic of people in Prague should be that if you allowed 80,000 Jews to be killed here, you should invite their relatives to live in a new Prague, rather than tell them you can go somewhere else. It's like you continue this idea, of course we don't want to exterminate you, but it's much better when you're outside of Europe. this bothers me a lot. But because I'm a third generation in Israel, that's my home. My parents came from Germany, but Germany is not my home. My home is Israel. And because I have much more in common with my Palestinian and Israeli friends than I have with my German Jewish relatives or American Jewish relatives, I put this aside and I want to build a society where the regime is behaving differently. Now, I don't have the power to stop the regime from doing what it does. So I'm calling on the outside world to pressure the regime to stop what it's doing. That's the idea, I think, of the BDS. And I'm very impressed by the success of this pressure of changing the reality in South Africa. That's where my point is. It's nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's whether you have the power from the inside to change a reality that you feel very troubled by. That's the question. How legitimate is it for a Czech person who believed, let's say in '67, that what he experiences is unacceptable? How legitimate was it to go to the West and ask to pressure the Soviet Union, let's say, and so on? Now, of course, if one does not accept that Israel is oppressive or that the situation is as I describe it, then I can see how the call for pressure on the outside would seem like something else. So I think that it's an analysis and prognosis. If you don't accept my analysis, then the prognosis can seem very subversive and anti-Jewish. But if you share the analysis, I think the prognosis, which is BDS in this respect, can become legitimate.
Yeah, this is exactly the point where we differ. Has it ever occurred to you, going back to the issue of anti-Semitism, or rather the history of the Jews, I am not Jewish, you know. I look at it as an outsider, so I might just give this observation. If I look at the history of European Jews, there are different periods, but they have always been in a minority here. And I can trace an interesting phenomenon. While Christians dominated Europe, the Jews were called, you know, the God killers and that stuff, and so they were discriminated against, but there was an escape clause. If a Jew wanted to become a respected member of the community at large, he had the path of conversion.
Right.
He would renounce all Jewish, and then he would become, although they might have been still seen with suspicion, but at least in theory there was an escape. Now with the Enlightenment, the Jewish people and the Jewish religion became again something that the progressive forces would despise, and the Jews were called upon by the rest of the society to again renounce the Jewish heritage and by assimilation, that's the word, becoming members of the society. Well, it didn't work that way quite fully, like the Dreyfus case shows, for instance, or we have our own case of a person who was also accused of blood libel at the end of 19th century, the Hilsner case, and so forth. So again, but this was the clause. And I see the common point in the larger society demanding of the Jews to get rid or to renounce the heritage as a prerequisite for being accepted by the world. Now, what if the current Jewish state, with all its mistakes and needs for correction, is seen by the outside world again as an epitome of the collective Jew, which is vilified in a very similar way? In my opinion, for instance, the criticism by others of Israel is far out of proportion when you compare it to other evils going around the world. So this is what I believe, that there is some element which is not healthy in it. And now the community demands the Jews to criticize Israel and in this way to renounce this Jewish heritage again, in order to be accepted by the large society at large. So how would you respond to this?
Yes. First of all, it's 3 points I'm thinking. When you were talking, I thought about 3 points. One is, it's very bizarre that the greatest supporters of Israel among the Christians in Europe prefer to fight for the rights of the Jews to be in Palestine and not to fight for the rights of the Jews to be in Europe. It's quite surprising for me, this whole idea. You sort of say, what can you do? The Jews wanted to assimilate. They were willing to assimilate, and then came Nazism and anti-Semitism. So we have to accept that we in Europe could not accept the Jews, so it's much better for the Jews to be in Asia, in the Middle East. I find it horrendous, actually. If I were a Christian German, I would fight for the right of the Jews to be equal citizens in Germany, not colonizers in Palestine. I can easily see how a German Christian who didn't like the idea of Jews, but of course was abhorred by the Nazis, would say this is much better than extermination camp, to have them in Palestine. That's much better. They're not in Germany, and we are not criminals. But that's history. It doesn't matter. This is, as you said, you're not a historian, I'm a historian, so I'm drawn to this. It doesn't matter what I'm trying to say, it doesn't matter. The state of Israel is now a fact, and you have a valid question about whether anti-Semitism can be anti-Israeli, Israelism, if you want. The point is the following. I think that your analysis, if I may so, is wrong. You claim that the impulse or the source for criticism Israel could be the fact that this is a Jewish state.
Yes.
And you somehow do not mention at all the record of what Israel is doing. One very important group to examine your analysis is the group of progressive Jews, not Christians, progressive Jews. Christians have a problem with Judaism, and they sort of debate between the idea of cherishing the Jews or waiting for a doomsday scenario where the Jews would convert to Christianity or be shish kebabbed in hell. But progressive Jews are an important group, because progressive Jews after 67 or up to 1967 saw Israel as the epitome of everything they dreamt of: a socialist, democratic Jewish state. And after 67, because I think 48 was not so much, people were not aware so much what Israel did in 1948, there was no television, it was much more hidden. But whatever Israel did after it occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip became an open book. And the more progressive Jews looked at what Israel is doing, the less they wanted to be identified with it. And I think if you look deeply into the roots of the solidarity movement with the Palestinians, with the major popular movements in the West that are now supporting the Palestinians, which are, among others, calling for the BDS option. You would, if you look at the history of these people, you will see two interesting things. One, the large number of Jews among them. And if you look at the biography of these Jews, you will see that they were quite Zionists up to 1967. It is the horrific treatment that Israel exercises in the occupied territories that changed their mind. They didn't become self-hating Jew because they went through a workshop that makes them self-hating Jew. The reality on the ground was something they could not identify with. And the second thing you will see about these people, they spearheaded the movements against racism in the southern United States, against dictatorships in Latin America, against apartheid South Africa. And they would have marched in '68 for Czechoslovakia, no doubt about it, no doubt about it. Actually, the group of people who are now leading the pro-Palestinian solidarity movement are graduates of other movements in the world against injustice. They're not graduates of anti-Semitic groups. On the contrary, I must tell you, maybe it's not obvious in Czechoslovakia, but it's very obvious in Britain. The extreme right wing in Britain, the Defense League, they come to every demonstration wrapped with the Israeli flag. In fact, the extreme right in Europe identifies with Israel much more than the extreme left, for obvious reasons, because they think that they are together in the battle against Islam and so on. So I think that although I can see the danger of what you're saying, And some of the fellow travelers, and I'm saying it very openly, some of the fellow travelers in the pro-Palestinian campaign are anti-Semitic. I'm saying it very clear and loudly. And I think the Palestinians sometimes are blind to that element in the pro-Palestinian movement. And I'm worried about it, as you are. But I don't think that the major impulse or the major body is moved by anti-Semitism. I think it's moved by universal sense of injustice. And you're right, and I will finish with this. You are right that compared to many other places in the world, Palestine is not the worst. But if you think of the last 100 years, it's quite a dismal story. What happened yesterday in Palestine is not as bad as what happened yesterday in Damascus. I agree. But what Israel did to the Palestinians from 1882 until today is quite bad. It's quite bad. It was a country which had a native local population which is almost distinct. It's almost not there. And 45 years of military occupation. How many modern history chapters of occupation we have that have lasted that long? How can even the most enlightened Quakers in the world be enlightened occupiers after 45 years? It's impossible. It's impossible. So let's respect the people in the West or elsewhere who say, I want to stop this occupation, and the Israelis don't have the incentive to do this. That's, I think, is my analysis.
Yeah. Okay. Just as a side issue, as a matter of fact, I have seen right-wing radicals in Prague marching with Palestinian flags because it fueled their Jew hatred. But there can be expressions of different kind. Well, let me finally ask one other question on the let's say, the right of the Jewish people to live in the land of Israel, if I might call it. You speak about colonizers and occupiers, but don't they have some historical right to that, given the history of the Jewish people to be there, or for a community of Jews to live in the land which is so much associated with its ancient history?
Yeah. I think that there are 2 points here which are very important. One is that Zionism was born as a very noble movement of national identity. And I'm not surprised at all that once Jews, because of what we talked about, the inability to assimilate properly in Europe, redefined themselves not just as a religion but also as a national movement. They were looking not just for the revival of their history and the language, but also were looking for a homeland. It's not surprising that Palestine was chosen, but as you probably know, Palestine was not the only option. So even they were aware that even if you lived somewhere 2,000 years before, your connection to that homeland is not the same as of those who lived there. Nobody would like to have the experience of the Palestinians, I think, of someone knocking on your door and say, excuse me, I used to live here 2,000 years ago. Would you please give me half of your house, at least? That would be a bit absurd. And I think the question is not, do the Jews who begin to see themselves as a national movement have some rights to Palestine, or do they have a connection to what was Palestine? The answer is in the positive. Of course they do have a connection. Of course they do have the right to exercise their religion there. But you know, as I do, ultra-Orthodox Jews will tell you, we never had the problem to be in Palestine. We don't need a Zionist state for this. That's their perspective. I'm not saying it's mine, but it's their perspective. So there are more than one way of materializing this connection. The question is, what do you do when you have such a right and someone else lives there? Let's say that you believe. And Zionism, we have to remember, Zionism was not only an answer to the problem of the Jews, it also appeared in the time of colonialism. We talk today about colonialism as a very negative phenomenon because we have other sensitivities. But in the late 19th century, when Zionism appeared, colonialism was not regarded as a bad thing. In fact, Herzl, if you read his way of writing, or the early Zionists who wrote in German, they talked about the colonization of Palestine, and they called the first Jewish settlements colonies, because this was not regarded a language which was negative. So Zionism, in fact, saw itself as a colonizing force in the late 19th century. It did not want to be associated with colonialism after the Second World War, because the PR of colonialism changed. But this basic historical fact is not changed. The Jews who came to Palestine, regardless of their connection, came as settlers from the outside, and the Palestinians were the natives. Now, in many ways, the Palestinians as a native population fared better than some other native population, like in the Americas, in Australia and New Zealand. They were not genocided. But the relationship was still very complicated. And therefore, I think that when we talk about the connection of the Jews to Palestine, it's on two levels. The one level which is really not important anymore is the one, if I may say so, I don't want to sound offensive, but the one you've raised. Do the Jews have a connection to Palestine? Do they have the right? They do, but do they have the right to dispossess someone else because of that? My answer is no. The question is if I may say so, the more important question is, now we have a third generation of Jewish settlers, if you want, that became an organic part of the place. And what do they have the right to be there? And to my great pleasure, I must say this is the most fundamental change in the attitude of the Palestinians towards the Israelis. That they accept that the surgeon, I'll put it this way, when you just come from Prague and you settle in Palestine, and I think that you are invading my country, and you just came 2 years before, I can dream that I can force you to go back. But if you're already a third generation there, my dream of forcing you to go back to Prague is unrealistic. It's unrealistic. And I think this sense that this is an unrealistic idea is now beginning to be understood by many, many more Palestinians. That's the Palestinian agency. I think that's the process that the Palestinians will have to complete, to accept that regardless of how they see the origins of Zionism, the Israeli Jews are not the origins of Zionism. They are now an integral part. On the other hand, the Zionist movement would have to understand its history. It would have to understand that they have to come into terms with the local people. Still, most of the Israeli Jews regard the Palestinians as aliens, that they tolerate. We can tolerate them. No, no, no. They have to tolerate us. They are the natives. We're not the natives. And I think, like in some other places, it would be a painful reconciliation process. But if you start it in the right place, you can end it in a good place. If you ignore it, that the major outcome of the Zionist project, whether it was intentional or not, is my discussion with other historians. Yes. It doesn't matter even. For me, it doesn't even matter. You know, I realize that even if I'm right or wrong in my assumption that the population was expelled by force, let's say I'm wrong about that. Let's say that the Israeli narrative is correct, the Palestinians were happy to leave. Yeah, like every people in the world, what do they care? They live in a place 500 years, you ask them to leave, they say happily, we don't even have to take anything, we'll just leave. Let's say that this is a reasonable narrative, and I'm a liar and fabricator and so on. The fact that they wanted to come back and were not allowed to come back is not a disputed fact. That's not, Israel officially says we will not allow the return of the refugees, right? I mean, this is not disputed. This ability to understand that you have to reconcile by allowing people to come back. Because if you allow an American Jew who is going to be born tomorrow to come to Israel as a citizen, you have to allow a Palestinian who used to live in Israel or became Israel to come back. And if you're not putting these two on a similar equation, and it would be very difficult for the Palestinians to accept what I'm asking them. I would ask them to continue to allow the next born Jew in Prague to, if they want to see Israel as their homeland and not the Czech Republic, to consider it as their homeland, as a legitimate homeland. But you need at least an equality because both demands have a historical weight and a reasonable historical weight. So I'm not denying the right of the Jews to Palestine. I'm afraid the Jews deny the right of the Palestinians to Palestine. That's my problem.
Okay. Maybe on the issue of ethnic cleansing and the dispossessing and transfers of peoples, my feeling is that I really admire the depth of humanity and the motivation for this whole approach of yours. Maybe it testifies to a very high sensitivity the Jewish people have for human rights abuse and so forth. Maybe even it is too much demanding or too much of a high goal to achieve in practice. That's maybe one of the problems. What comes to my mind if I hear about ethnic cleansing? First of all, this was first used in former Yugoslavia in the 90s, and we know what kind of atrocities were perpetrated. And it brings some images which I doubt are correctly transferable to that situation. But what comes to my mind also is the history of my country. At the end of World War II, we had 3 million Germans. And there was a clear plan to get rid of them, which was carried out. You find no Germans here today. So whatever ethnic cleansing is, this was a case of a consummated policy, which ended in expelling all the Germans, creating ethnically homogeneous Czech Republic, and in the process there were atrocities perpetrated by Czechs, and we still have gone by far not as far as you have in Israel in addressing these issues. It still plagues our national psyche because I think we will agree that any wrongdoing in the past, unless it is confronted honestly and openly, creates a reservoir from which hatred and prejudice can still feed itself. We felt it just recently. We had a presidential election, and one of the surprising, to me at least, surprising question which surfaced was the treatment of the Sudeten Germans 70 years ago. And I read commentaries in German press, and they were all surprised how the presidential election in Czech Republic was not about the future of our country, but was, controlled by events 70 years ago. And to me, the answer is clear. It has so much power because it has never been openly confronted. Václav Havel once tried to raise this issue, but it was doused, and the majority of our society is not ready to confront it. So I can see the problem. So this is a case of, we may call it a transfer of population or an ethnic cleansing or whatever. But Israel may have tried, I don't know, historians disagree about the intent, there is no dispute about some of the facts, but the fact is that there are still Arabs living in Israel proper, if we leave out the occupied territories. So to me, this is exactly why we have so many problems, because if I wanted to be cynical, I could say that if Israel had forced them completely then Israel would not have this problem, whether Jewish or democratic. So, I'm just trying to put it into perspective. I'm not saying that it is not acceptable, but there are other transfers of population which took place, especially after World War II, in large proportions. So I think this should also be somehow kept in perspective.
Yeah, I think it's first of all, I would be very worried if I wouldn't go that way of saying that that's the point of my former colleague Benny Morris, that it would have been better if Israel would have expelled all the Palestinians, then we would not have had a problem. which is nonsense, by the
I'm
way.
not saying this.
Yeah, I know. I'm saying it's like saying that if the Germans would have killed all the Jews, nobody would have found the Germans guilty of anything, because there would no one then to be worried about it. I think that there is a difference between what I call the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the historical cases you mentioned. There are some similarities, but I think there's one big difference. If indeed the idea of making Palestine as Jewish as possible would have been a matter of the past, then I think it would have been much easier to reconcile with that event. Whether we accept my narrative or not, it would have been easier. And not because some Palestinians were left. Out of the 1 million Palestinians who lived in what became Israel, only 150,000 were left. So it's not such a great noble act of allowing people to stay. I'm still finding, as an historian, I'm still looking, I must say, for the reasons why some of them were allowed to stay and while the majority were expelled. But that's an historical issue, I agree. The worrying thing about Israel's ethnic cleansing is that it has not ended. Between 1967 and until today, in the Greater Jerusalem area, which Israel regards as de jure part of Israel, despite the fact that it was the West Bank before that, more than 250,000 Palestinians were expelled from 1967 until today. Not in the same way that they were expelled in 1948, by not being allowed to return, by being pushed to the West Bank. And this will continue, and I think we are missing the main point here. The main point is not the ethnic cleansing of 1948, but the main point, and that's the difference between the Czech Republic and Israel, is what is the motive for the ethnic cleansing. Now I can understand, I'm not justifying, but I can understand the Czech Republic motive, or wasn't Czech, it was Czechoslovakia, motive for cleaning the Sudeten from the German population in the context of the history of 45 and so on. You would agree that if by chance there would have been today, let's say 200,000 Germans in that area, if in 2013 a Czech politician would have said we should get rid of these Germans because of what happened in the Second World War, one would assume that the vast majority of Czech would say no way, no way, this is not justified. This is not what the Israelis are saying, because even the most liberal Zionists, and you know that, for good reasons from their perspective, say we need a Jewish majority to be a democratic state. So what do you do when you're not a Jewish majority? So the left in Israel says we are willing to give up some territory in order to keep the demographic majority. But what happens if this doesn't work? What do? You kill every third Arab baby? What is the... You know, I once asked a Labour politician, not a right-wing politician. I brought him a very reasonable scenario, that however you provide the two-state solution, and he agreed with me, in 2025 the Jews are not a majority even inside Israel. So what do you do? He didn't know. So I suggested, I said, let's kill every second Arab child. He said, no way. I said, so let's expel every second Arab village. He said, what, do you think we are criminals? And I said, so give me a solution. And he had no answer. And I don't know what he thinks about the solution. That's what I'm saying. If you think, and we talked about it enough, one can understand why there is an Israeli Jewish obsession of having a Jewish majority. We probably agree about the historical reasons, but we cannot ignore the moral consequences of this demand. You cannot ignore it. And it will lead to vilification of Israel, even if you're a good-hearted person who loves Israel, who likes the Jews. You yourself will have a problem. You will have a problem because there is no political way of solving this problem. The Palestinians will continue to have babies. The Palestinians will continue to be in Palestine. At one given point, the Jews will not be a majority. So what are you going to do then? You're going to continue to do the ethnic cleansing. And I think what Israeli politicians are doing sometimes unintentionally, they continue to ethnically cleanse Palestine on a smaller scale because they want to distance themselves from the moment when they would say, we have lost all the options. And as you know, if you heard the speeches by Netanyahu and others, and I think they're right from their perspective, you don't need the Palestinians to be 50% to feel that you've lost the Jewish majority. Netanyahu said, and I think most of the Israeli strategists agree with him, that if in a Jewish state the Palestinians are more than 30%, it's the end of the Jewish state. So we don't even have to wait to a demographic revolution. And that's a real issue. Whether Ilan Pappe is an anti-Zionist or not is not important. The important thing is my moral solution is clear. I don't care whether they're 30% or 50%. You care. You are obsessed with counting how many Arabs there are in the state of Israel. This is an unhealthy mental obsession, you know, apart from anything else. It's very unhealthy to keep counting how many Arabs there are all the time. You asked me about my children. I don't want them to live in a state where the politicians keep counting how many Arabs live there. I want them to count how much money is there in the budget to distribute it fairly among the people. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I believe we are not in the position to create the final solution.
No, we are individuals. So.
Being Christian, I would venture to say that when the Messiah finally comes, he is probably the only one qualified to give it a lasting solution. I thank you very much for your points. We still agree to disagree on some, but I wish there'll be more people like you on both sides that would work towards a just and peaceful solution.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you.